This is the CFL Weekly Picks podcast. I am Russell Clay. You can find me on Twitter at Russell J. Clay. We're going to review the four-game weekly slate, as they always are, 4 games, and they obviously split the slate up. We appreciate DraftKings for providing us with football in the summer, and we're on to week 3, so let's break it down real quick. In terms of, I also wrote this up, so if you want to check that out, you can check that out on dailyfantasycafe.com with our written content. There's some CFL content in there if that's your appeal as well. So let's get into it real quick. Winnipeg versus Hamilton, over under 52 in this game. Hamilton, pretty big favorites, -9. So you definitely have to take that into account. In terms of cash games, I'm really looking at Andrew Harris for running back here. Only 7,900, and he's really racking up the receptions there. He's got 15 in the first 2 weeks, and that's obviously because Winnipeg's been sort of down and chasing the teams they've been facing so far. So he's been really racking up that third down role receptions. So definitely a guy to keep in mind. There aren't a lot of strong running back options on this slate. So you're kind of looking for what you can grab there, especially if you can find some relatively consistent receptions, which they will be, especially if the spread sort of represents what it's going to be. So definitely take a look at him. And Luke Tasker for Hamilton, above 7 receptions and 70 yards in each of the first 2 games. So that's definitely something you want to take into account. You want that high floor. If you are going to play cash games on this 4-game slate, which I actually do think there's still a pretty considerable edge in these first few weeks of CFL with people sort of catching up on research and everything. So cash games are in play for me, and he's a pretty reasonable option at 8,400. He is one of the top options in that passing game, and you do like the 27.5 projected point total for Hamilton there. So definitely someone I'm looking at. And in terms of everything else there, I mean, I think we're on the tournaments. So in that same vein, we're looking at Jeremiah Masoli, 8,800. Pretty good deal there. As mentioned, Hamilton is a pretty big favorite. Masoli had a rough week in week 2, but I don't think we can forget about the 311 passing yards and 3 touchdowns he had in week 1. I'd expect it gets back to more of that type of tempo and more of that type of offensive production in week 3. So 8,800, one of the cheapest quarterbacks on the slate, definitely what I'm looking at there. And then our last tournament guy, Tequan Underwood, 3,900. Obviously an unreal price. Just got back into action for Hamilton last week. 3 receptions, 45 yards, in a tough matchup where I mentioned Masoli struggled. So in terms of that, obviously Tequan, a former NFL player, played for the Bucs for a few years, actually got some pretty decent run with that offense as the third receiving option. I actually thought he was going to stick for a little while there. Former Rutgers player, highly athletic. So I do think he's going to take on that deep threat vertical role. And if he does, I think we could see some pretty big plays this week out of basically a min player. So I think he's a great tournament option and probably not cash game consideration, but 3,900 is a great option in tournaments there. And as far as a value goes, we're looking at Darvin Adams, a former Auburn player, obviously had the big touchdowns in each of the first 2 games. I'd say he has a pretty high floor based on what his role was the first 2 weeks. I think you're looking at 14 to 15 DK points. Obviously, you can't count on that touchdown every week. But in general, I think we're looking at a pretty reasonable floor. Sorry, a little coffee there. Pretty reasonable floor there. 14 to 15 DK points, 7,700. If you can get that, I think you're happy at the end of the day. So on to the next game here. We're looking at Toronto and BC. BC, the home favorite, -5 there. So when you look at this Toronto team, obviously projected for one of the lower point totals, but I think that kind of represents these two wide receivers here, Torrey Gurley and Vidal Hazelton. I was on Gurley last week. He didn't really do much. He had that one big play for 32 yards, but obviously that was his only reception. So that was rather disappointing and probably crushed you in a tournament, even if you did have strong other options there. But Hazelton, obviously the 56-yard touchdown, but he only had 2 receptions. And again, that's what I was worried about after week 1. Not necessarily the big playability. I know he has that. That's clearly in his game. But will he get the weekly volume? And last week he did not. He got lucky. So if you played him, obviously you'll take it. But I think you do have to be worried going forward about what his sort of weekly receptions and targets are going to look like. So I still like Torrey Gurley. He's probably a bit too expensive for me this week, but at the same time, I do think he is a pretty reasonable tournament play at 6,900. Hazelton, I think you can ride it out. Maybe see if you can get another touchdown this week at 7,600. That's pretty reasonable for obviously what he's been doing the first 2 weeks, but it is a bit of a fluky touchdown production at this stage in the year. So while he has produced, you got to worry what his stat lines are going to look like in weeks he doesn't score a touchdown. So I think that's what you're looking at from their side of the ball. And then a fun guy here, Chris Rainey, obviously former Florida Gator, former basically Olympian. He's a track star. He's the return guy for BC, and obviously 149 return yards in week 1 with a touchdown and a 1-yard rushing touchdown. And then last week had 149 return yards, which obviously gets you points in this format. So something to keep in mind. Not necessarily the highest floor, but and I don't think you can expect 150 return yards every week. But at the same time, I mean, he's an elite athlete, and I expect that to continue in some respect throughout the year. And in terms of just having an offensive weapon, you'd think they start to use him a little more offensively as the season goes on. You can't expect that or put him into your lineups expecting his role to grow, though. He's a punt and kick returner right now. And obviously that's fine for now. If you can get another touchdown there, 7 to 10 points, I think is pretty reasonable at 6,100. So obviously not what you're looking for, but I do have him as a tournament play. I think he could have some pretty decent upside. Now, again, second to Tiquan, I think Sean Gore, or maybe even better than Tiquan in terms of what he's produced the first 2 weeks. I do like the matchup a little bit better for Tiquan, but you can't go wrong with Sean Gore this week at 4,600, averaging 5.5 receptions and 92 receiving yards over the first 2 weeks. 7 for 67 in week 1. I think that's a little more reasonable. He obviously had over 100 last week. So, I mean, I think he's definitely a guy to keep an eye on, and he isn't the first option in that offense, but at the same time, 4,600, you can't deny that, especially with his production in the first 2 weeks. So, this is basically his rookie year. I think his role is going to continue to look like this. And I mean, if he continues to produce like this in the limited-ish role, I don't see why it can't grow. So, definitely a guy you want to keep in mind. And if you're trying to fit in this next stack we're going to be talking about here, definitely a guy you want to keep an eye on. And let's get into it. Calgary, Ottawa. Calgary -1 favorites. So basically a pick 'em, over under a 53. Chris Williams versus Trevor Harris. I mean, this has been a monstrous combination. Trevor Harris came in that week 1 and 17 and 19 for 3 passing touchdowns. So in that week 1 matchup, and obviously 2 of them went to Chris Williams. Chris Williams just dominating the first 2 weeks of the season. Former New Mexico State receiver. He's small, listed at 5'8", 175, but at the same time, Borderline elite athlete. Size adjusted, not as great, but he did run a 4.33 40 at his pro day. So that's something to keep in mind. And that was a few years ago. Spent a few years with the Bears as a kick returner, punt returner. But I mean, he's just dominant to start the season, and I don't see why you wouldn't trust it at this stage. Obviously not expecting 175 receiving yards every week, but 100 yards and a touchdown. He's the main weapon in that offense. They're expected to score over 25 points this week, so I don't see why he wouldn't get his once again. I think you can rely on this stack with Trevor Harris as a pretty high floor, and I don't see why you wouldn't go back to them again. And as I mentioned, you have two relatively cheap options there that have some upside, so I'd be looking at them in tournaments. Definitely a tournament lineup you want to throw in there with Chris Williams and Trevor Harris. Obviously mentioning Sean Gore and Tequan Underwood. Jumping down here, in terms of tournaments, we're looking at Brad Sinopoli. He's sort of the second option in that offense, 7,300, so really reasonable. Along with Vidal Hazelton and Chris Williams, he's tied for the lead in touchdowns through the first 2 weeks. So definitely like to see that. Obviously in a solid offense with the two guys I mentioned above. So all the emphasis isn't necessarily going to be on him. He's more of the intermediate guy, but at the same time, you'll take that. He's got a nice, comfortable role. You kind of know what you're getting. High floor. So 7,300, I'll definitely take that. Moving down here, Jerome Massam for Calgary, 7,500. Really the only guy that's produced in terms of a strong rushing performance so far this year. Last week, 16 attempts for 137 rushing yards. I don't think you can expect that against this Ottawa defense, but at the same time, it is a positive indicator and much better than what you're seeing from the other running backs on this slate. Other than receptions, it's pretty much been non-existent. So definitely looking at that there. If he gets a rushing touchdown, you're obviously liking that floor. So definitely like that there. If you're looking deep, Ottawa lost their running back last week, Trayvon Van, and that obviously put Keenan LaFrance in. He got 14 touches last week, and I expect sort of a similar role this week. I don't see anyone necessarily taking that role. Maybe they sub someone in for a few snaps, but beyond that, he's the guy. 4,700, super cheap, in an offense that is expected to do pretty well again. So I'm in on that. I'm in on this Ottawa offense pretty much all around. So if you want to throw him in there to average out some of those quarterback and wide receiver prices, I love that call. And the last one of the day, or of the slate, obviously on a Friday, 10 p.m., Saskatchewan versus Edmonton. 10-point spread. Edmonton, big favorites at home. So I think you're definitely looking at this defense if you want to pay up for that, and some of these Edmonton players. Adarius Bowman kind of got his shine stolen away from him as the top receiving option through the first few weeks, with Chris Williams just putting up some amazing performances. But yeah, Adarius Bowman, former Oklahoma State dominant, productive college receiver, obviously been dominating the CFL for quite a few years now. And I think he's in a great spot again to get over 100 yards and a touchdown. So he's the main weapon in that offense. They're going to go to him. He's a productive receiver, so you got to like that. 9,600. It is a little bumped down from Chris Williams. So I think you can get some, not quite the same upside, but similar upside from him this week. So I do like that quite a bit, and that's a nice swerve. And I mean, you can play both in cash, in my opinion. So fit them in, get some of those cheaper options in there, and I think you can fire away with that. So getting into the run game a little bit here. Obviously, John White had a big week in week 1. So he accumulated 26.9 DK points on 16 touches, I mean. But he did score 2 touchdowns. I think that's a little inflated here. Him and Curtis Steele are in that same sort of range here, getting 15, 16 touches a week, maybe 20 if we're lucky. Hopefully get some run in the receiving game, get those receptions. You definitely like that. Both priced $7K, 62. I think both have a pretty reasonable shot at some production from the running back spot, which is kind of what you're looking for. Steele more of the tournament play because he's on obviously the worst offense, projected for quite a few less points there. So I'd go White over Steele, but at the same time, I'm okay with Steele as a tournament swerve. And Naaman Roosevelt, I think he's pretty intriguing here. Obviously, 9 receptions for 113 receiving yards last week against Toronto. Big underdogs again this week. I think you're worried about this in terms of potential railroading production. But at the same time, 7,500, nice swerve off the top options, and obviously has the talent and athleticism to thrive in the CFL. Former Buffalo Bill, really good athleticism in terms of 40 time and height adjusted athleticism. So definitely a guy you want to look at. Darian Durant obviously has some chemistry with him. That's what you're looking at there. And one more guy near the min here, Ricky Collins. Obviously, found a bit of a role last week with 56 receiving yards. So that's kind of what you're looking at there for a min guy. But in a tournament, it's probably not going to do it for you. I think you just look for some of the higher upside options I mentioned. So I think that's the general consensus on what we're going to be doing here. I think you can get some low-owned guys here, especially Tiquan. Again, he's coming off injury, played a tough matchup last week, and I think he's going to be that vertical threat for that offense. So you could see some boom in production there. As always, I think that's it for here, but make sure to check out Daily Fantasy Cafe for all our awesome tools and content. And obviously, we're going to continue with the CFL content throughout the season. So make sure to check that out. And always hit me up on Twitter if you have any questions. So thanks for tuning in, guys.